A single government order. $14 billion frozen overnight. And now Beijing is threatening the Netherlands with an $18 billion lawsuit that could redefine how the world sees European investment. This is the Nexperia crisis, and it's spiraling out of control. The semiconductor industry rarely makes headlines for drama. It's a world of clean rooms, microscopic circuits, and supply chain logistics that keep the global economy humming quietly in the background. But in late 2025, that quiet world exploded into a full-blown international confrontation, one that has now pulled in two governments, billions of dollars in frozen assets, and the future of Europe's automotive industry. At the centre of it all is Nexperia, a Dutch-registered semiconductor company with Chinese ownership. You've probably never heard of them. But if you've driven a car built in the last 5 years, there's a good chance their chips are inside it, managing power systems, controlling electric motors, regulating voltage across dozens of critical functions. Nexperia doesn't make the flashy cutting-edge processors that power your smartphone or laptop. They make the unglamorous components that keep cars, factories and industrial machines running. And in September 2025, the Dutch government effectively shut them down. It happened without warning. On September 30th, Dutch authorities issued a sweeping ministerial order that froze 30 Nexperia entities across the globe. Nearly $15 billion in assets were placed under government restriction. The company's leadership, handpicked by its Chinese parent company, Wingtech Technology, was removed from operational control. And then came the truly extraordinary part. The Dutch government announced plans to seize 99% of the company's shares, leaving Chinese investors with nothing but a symbolic stake. The official explanation: national security and economic stability. But the consequences were immediate and brutal. Manufacturing timelines collapsed. Shipments to major customers in Europe and beyond were suspended. Expansion projects that had been years in the making were abandoned overnight. And across the global automotive supply chain, a ripple of panic began to spread. Nexperia wasn't just another chip company. It was a linchpin, a supplier so deeply embedded in the production networks of European car makers that its sudden paralysis threatened to halt assembly lines from Germany to France to Italy. Within days, Beijing responded with a move of its own. Chinese regulators imposed strict export controls on Nexperia's China-based factories, effectively banning the company from shipping products abroad. Since roughly 70% of Nexperia's manufacturing capacity is located in China, this countermeasure didn't just hurt the company, it crippled it. And now China has given the Netherlands an ultimatum: restore Wingtech's control over Nexperia within 6 months, or face international arbitration and a compensation claim of up to $18 billion. This is no longer just a corporate dispute. It's a legal, geopolitical and economic showdown, and it's forcing the world to ask a difficult question. When does national security end and expropriation begin? To understand how Nexperia ended up in the crosshairs, you have to go back to 2016, a year when the semiconductor industry was undergoing a wave of massive consolidation. At the time, Nexperia didn't exist as an independent company. It was a division of NXP Semiconductors, a major Dutch chipmaker with roots stretching back to Philips. The division specialized in discrete components, small, reliable, unglamorous chips used in automotive and industrial applications. Not cutting edge, not glamorous, but highly profitable. Then Qualcomm, the American tech giant, announced a deal to acquire NXP for over $40 billion. European competition regulators stepped in and demanded that NXP divest its standard products division to avoid monopolistic concerns. That division was spun off, restructured and rebranded as Nexperia. But there was a problem. Without the financial backing of its former parent company, Nexperia was bleeding money. It needed a buyer, and fast. Enter Wingtech Technology, a Chinese electronics manufacturer backed by a state-linked investment consortium. In 2017, Wingtech completed a two-stage acquisition of Nexperia for approximately $3.9 billion. At the time, the deal raised no alarms. European regulators approved it without hesitation. There were no security reviews, no political objections, no public debate. It was treated as a straightforward commercial transaction, a Chinese company buying a struggling European semiconductor business. Nothing more. And for the next several years, the arrangement worked. Under Chinese ownership, Nexperia stabilized. It returned to profitability. It expanded its global supply chain and deepened partnerships with major automotive suppliers like Bosch, Continental and ZF. European facilities stayed operational. Jobs were preserved. Management remained largely local. From Europe's perspective, Nexperia was a success story, a foreign acquisition that had saved a Dutch company and kept it competitive. From China's perspective, it was proof that cross-border industrial integration could work. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. When people talk about restricting China's access to semiconductors, they usually focus on the United States. Washington has led the charge, imposing export controls, blacklisting Chinese firms, pressuring allies to cut off access to advanced chip-making equipment. But Europe has been playing its own quiet game. Over the past few years, multiple European governments have tightened restrictions on semiconductor exports to China. These measures are often framed as routine regulatory updates or security assessments. But in practice, they've had sharp, disruptive consequences. Blocked deals, severed partnerships, stranded investments. The Netherlands has been particularly active. As the home of ASML, the world's only manufacturer of extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, essential for producing the most advanced chips, the Dutch government holds enormous leverage in the global semiconductor supply chain. And increasingly, that leverage has been used to align with US policy toward China. But Nexperia was different. It wasn't producing cutting-edge chips. It wasn't working on military applications. It was making automotive components, chips that go into brake systems, electric vehicle powertrains, industrial controllers. The kind of technology that's been exported to China for decades without controversy. So why did the Dutch government suddenly move to seize control? The official explanation cited national security and economic resilience. But critics have pointed to a different motive, political pressure from the United States and growing anxiety in Europe about Chinese ownership of strategic assets. In recent years, several European countries have blocked or unwound Chinese acquisitions in sensitive sectors: telecommunications, infrastructure, technology. Nexperia, despite its relatively mundane product line, became the latest target. But this time, the intervention wasn't a quiet regulatory veto. It was a full-scale government takeover, one that has now triggered a legal and diplomatic crisis. The immediate impact of the Dutch government's decision was, well, chaos. Nexperia's operations didn't just slow down, they ground to a halt. With Chinese leadership removed and key decisions now requiring government approval, the company lost the ability to function autonomously. Strategic planning stopped. Hiring froze. Investment decisions were suspended. And then came the export ban from China. By blocking Nexperia's China-based factories from shipping products abroad, Beijing effectively severed the company's global supply chain. Since 70% of Nexperia's manufacturing capacity is in China, this meant that the vast majority of its production was suddenly cut off from international customers. For Nexperia's clients, particularly in the automotive industry, the consequences were immediate and, honestly, pretty severe. Automotive manufacturers rely on just-in-time supply chains, where components arrive exactly when needed to avoid costly inventory storage. Any disruption can halt production, and Nexperia supplies critical components to some of Europe's biggest car makers and their suppliers: Bosch, Continental, ZF, Denso. According to available data, automotive sales account for nearly 60% of Nexperia's revenue, roughly 8.8 billion yuan, out of a total annual revenue of around 14.7 billion yuan. That's how deeply embedded the company is in the European automotive ecosystem. When shipments stopped, orders were postponed. Long-term contracts stalled. In some cases, business relationships collapsed entirely as customers scrambled to find alternative suppliers. But alternative suppliers aren't easy to find. The semiconductor industry is highly specialized. Switching to a new vendor requires extensive testing, certification, and integration, a process that can take months or even years. As the disruption deepened, pressure on the Dutch government intensified. Leading European automakers, many of whom depend on Nexperia's chips, began urging Dutch authorities to resolve the crisis quickly. The stakes were enormous. Prolonged supply shortages could force assembly lines across Europe to shut down, costing billions in lost production. It was a vivid reminder of just how fragile global supply chains have become, and how a single government decision can trigger cascading failures across entire industries. Beijing didn't just respond with export controls, it also launched a legal offensive. In December 2025, Chinese authorities formally filed a compensation claim against the Netherlands, demanding up to $18 billion in damages. The claim was accompanied by a stark ultimatum: restore Wingtech's lawful control over Nexperia within 6 months, or face international arbitration. At first glance, $18 billion might seem inflated, perhaps even punitive. But, a closer look at the numbers reveals a more grounded calculation. Wingtech originally paid $3.9 billion to acquire Nexperia back in 2017. In the years that followed, the company invested more than an additional $1 billion into expanding manufacturing capacity, upgrading technology, and strengthening global operations. Then there's the question of valuation. Between 2017 and 2025, Nexperia's market value increased significantly as demand for automotive semiconductors surged. The company had returned to profitability, expanded its customer base, and solidified its position as a key supplier to the global automotive industry. When you factor in lost revenue, stranded investments, and the appreciation in the company's value, the $18 billion figure starts to look less like bluster and more like a serious legal argument. From an international law perspective, China's position is strong. Several independent legal analysts have pointed out weaknesses in the Dutch government's case: lack of transparency, insufficient legal justification, and potential violations of international investment treaties. If the dispute goes to arbitration, China could very well win. But winning an arbitration case doesn't guarantee payment. History is full of examples where governments have delayed, resisted, or negotiated down arbitration awards. Take Spain, for instance. In 2013, the Spanish government retroactively cut renewable energy subsidies, triggering dozens of arbitration claims under the Energy Charter Treaty. The total claims exceeded $11 billion. Spain lost most of those cases, but compensation was delayed, and in some instances investors had to pursue enforcement through foreign assets. Similar patterns have played out in other jurisdictions. Arbitration awards are binding in theory, but enforcement can be slow, partial, or politically complicated. So even if China wins, it may not see the full $18 billion. The actual payout could be much smaller, perhaps a negotiated settlement, a partial payment, or a drawn-out legal battle that takes years to resolve. But that's not the only reason China is pursuing this case. The Nexperia dispute isn't just about money, it's about precedent. If China succeeds in arbitration, even if it recovers only a fraction of the claimed amount, it will establish a powerful legal benchmark. It will formally confirm that the Dutch government's actions constituted an unlawful expropriation, and it will hold the Netherlands accountable under international investment law. That precedent matters. It sends a signal to other governments considering similar moves. Seizing foreign-owned assets carries legal and financial risks. But perhaps more importantly, the case is already damaging the Netherlands' reputation as a stable, predictable destination for foreign investment. For decades, the Netherlands has positioned itself as one of Europe's most business-friendly countries, a gateway to the European market with a transparent legal system, strong property rights, and a welcoming attitude toward international capital. The Nexperia crisis threatens that image. Investors around the world are watching closely. If a major foreign-owned company can be effectively expropriated on national security grounds, without clear evidence of wrongdoing, without due process, and without compensation, then what's to stop it from happening again? For an economy as dependent on foreign investment as the Netherlands, that reputational damage could be far more costly than any arbitration award. Step back, and the Nexperia case reveals something much larger: the growing collision between geopolitics and global commerce. For decades, the world economy has been built on the idea that trade and investment should flow freely across borders, governed by rules, treaties and institutions designed to reduce risk and promote cooperation. But that system is under strain. As competition between the United States and China intensifies, governments are increasingly willing to use economic tools, sanctions, export controls, investment restrictions, as instruments of geopolitical strategy. Europe is caught in the middle. On one hand, European countries want to maintain strong economic ties with China, which remains a massive market and a critical source of investment. On the other hand, they face intense pressure from Washington to align with United States policy and restrict Chinese access to sensitive technologies. The Nexperia crisis is a microcosm of that tension. It shows what happens when political considerations override commercial logic, and when governments prioritize strategic alignment over legal consistency. But it also exposes the vulnerabilities of global supply chains. Semiconductors are the lifeblood of modern industry, and the production of those semiconductors is concentrated in a handful of countries. When governments intervene to disrupt those flows, the consequences ripple across the entire global economy. In this case, the disruption has hit the automotive industry hardest, but the implications extend far beyond cars. if critical components can be suddenly cut off for political reasons, then no industry is truly secure. So where does this leave us? As of now, the 6-month deadline set by China is ticking. If the Dutch government doesn't restore Wingtech's control over Nexperia, Beijing will move forward with international arbitration. The legal battle could take years. The financial outcome is uncertain. But the broader implications are already clear. The Nexperia crisis has exposed the fragility of global supply chains, the rising use of economic measures as geopolitical weapons, and the risks that come with mixing national security concerns with commercial investment. It has also raised a fundamental question that will define the next decade of international economic relations. Can the world maintain an open, rules-based system for trade and investment? Or are we entering an era where political considerations trump legal commitments, where governments can seize assets at will, and where global commerce is increasingly shaped by rivalry rather than cooperation? For the Netherlands, the decisions made in the coming months will determine not just Nexperia's fate, but the country's credibility as a stable and reliable partner for international investors. For China, the case is a test of whether international law can still provide recourse when foreign assets are seized without due process. And for the rest of the world, it's a stark reminder that in the new era of great power competition, even a humble chipmaker can become a flashpoint. And even the smallest disruptions can have consequences that reach far beyond the boardroom. The Nexperia crisis is far from over. But one thing is already certain. The way it ends will shape how governments, companies and investors navigate the increasingly turbulent intersection of technology, trade and geopolitics for years to come.